What happens when the most powerful meeting in America suddenly goes off script? Cameras roll, executives freeze, aides panic, and within seconds the illusion of control begins to crack. Today's story isn't about politics, it's about power, focus, and a moment inside the White House that left even friendly media searching for the exit. Stay with me, because what you're about to see explains far more than one meeting ever could. It starts not with shouting or chaos, but with something far more unsettling, a quiet moment inside the most powerful building on earth where everyone in the room knows the script, knows the cameras are rolling, knows the stakes are global, and yet nobody knows what the president will do next. Because what unfolded in that room wasn't just awkward, it wasn't just embarrassing. It was revealing in a way that makes your stomach tighten if you're paying attention. As Donald Trump sat across from oil executives in what was supposed to be a controlled, choreographed display of power and competence, and instead became a slow-motion collapse of focus, discipline, and presidential instinct. The kind of moment aides dread because it can't be spun, can't be edited out in real time, and can't be blamed on anyone else, and from the very first minutes you could feel it slipping. The rambling praise, the fixation on strength, the repetitive self-congratulation, the way every sentence bent back toward himself, as if governing, diplomacy, economics, even global conflict were just props in a performance designed to feed his ego. And this wasn't a rally, this wasn't a campaign stage with cheering supporters willing to fill in the gaps. This was a room full of executives, officials, and cameras expecting coherence, expecting leadership, expecting a president who could stay on track long enough to deliver a message that mattered, and instead what they got was a man drifting, improvising, contradicting himself, veering into bizarre military metaphors about armadas and waves, talking about Venezuela as if it were both conquered and unresolved at the same time, declaring victory while hinting at force, projecting dominance while sounding confused, and all of it happening in front of people who understood exactly what was at stake financially, politically, and historically. Because this meeting wasn't about patriotism or security, it was about money, power, and access, about corporations positioning themselves to profit from geopolitical instability, and Trump soaking in their approval like oxygen, smiling at their praise, basking in the flattery, losing the thread of what he was even supposed to say. And that's when the first crack became impossible to ignore, because Marco Rubio, seated nearby, did something no cabinet official wants to do on camera. He intervened, quietly sliding a note toward the president, not as a policy suggestion, not as a strategic adjustment, but as a basic redirection, a reminder to return to the script, to move the meeting along, to focus. And Trump's reaction to that note told you everything: the confusion, the irritation, the public reading of it aloud, the need to reassert dominance even as he revealed he'd lost his place, turning what should have been a seamless transition into an uncomfortable spectacle. And as the executives tried to resume talking about production numbers and operations on the ground, Trump's attention visibly wandered, his body language restless, his eyes drifting, his mind elsewhere, as if the substance bored him now that the praise had slowed. And this is where the moment crossed from awkward into alarming, because leadership at this level isn't about charisma or bravado. It's about sustained focus, about understanding consequences, about listening long enough to make decisions that don't spiral into disaster. And yet here was the President of the United States mentally checking out of a meeting dealing with international energy, sanctions, and geopolitical leverage. And then, astonishingly, he did what no one in that room could have predicted or stopped. He stood up, mid-meeting, mid-remarks, mid-camera, and decided to wander, announcing his intention to go look at the ballroom, as if touring decor were suddenly more important than the discussion unfolding around him. And in that instant, the room froze. Aides panicked, executives exchanged glances, and viewers watching at home felt that jolt of disbelief, because this wasn't a joke. This wasn't a lighthearted aside. This was a president abandoning the meeting he had called on live television for a personal whim, and the symbolism couldn't have been sharper if it were scripted. The most powerful man in the world interrupting a serious policy discussion to admire a room, a literal hall built and funded by the very interests sitting before him, interests whose wealth would grow as long as he remained favorable, compliant, distracted, and eager for applause. And as Trump wandered off, marveling at the view, commenting on the space, indulging in self-congratulation about how beautiful it was, Fox News did something extraordinarily rare. They cut away, not because of editorial judgment, but because the moment was too damaging to air uninterrupted, too difficult to defend, too obviously out of bounds even for a network accustomed to smoothing over its excesses. And when a media outlet built to protect you decides live coverage is no longer safe, that's not bias, that's triage. And this is where the story stops being about one meeting and starts being about a pattern, because what we witnessed wasn't an isolated lapse. It was a distilled version of a presidency defined by impulse over preparation, ego over responsibility, praise over policy, a man who demands loyalty but cannot maintain focus, who claims strength but avoids substance, who confuses dominance with chaos, and who treats the machinery of government like a stage set for his personal validation. And the reason this moment hit so hard is because it peeled back the curtain, showing the reality behind the slogans and theatrics, showing a leader unable or unwilling to follow his own script, dependent on aides to steer him back to basics, visibly irritated by information that doesn't flatter him, and ultimately more interested in a ballroom than in the consequences of the power he wields. And as the meeting lurched forward without him, as officials scrambled to restore order, the image burned itself into the public consciousness, not as comedy, not as parody, but as a warning, because governance isn't about looking strong, it's about being capable, and capability requires attention, discipline, and respect for the gravity of the office, qualities that were conspicuously absent in that room. And as the cameras cut, the questions lingered, not about oil contracts or production numbers, but about fitness, judgment, and what it means when the President of the United States treats the world's most serious responsibilities like an inconvenience interrupting his tour. What made that moment even more unsettling wasn't just the president standing up and wandering away. It was what happened in the seconds after, the barely concealed scramble among aides, the forced smiles, the awkward pauses, the way officials instinctively shifted from participants to damage control mode. Because everyone in that room understood the unspoken rule of power. When the president loses the thread publicly, the system around him has to absorb the shock before it ripples outward. And you could practically feel the panic behind the polished faces as they tried to pretend this was normal, tried to keep the meeting alive without its central figure, tried to maintain the illusion of control while cameras were still rolling. And this is where the behind-the-scenes reality of modern American power reveals itself, because these meetings are never spontaneous. Every word is pre-approved, every transition rehearsed, every moment calibrated to send a signal to markets, allies, and adversaries. And yet none of that preparation can save you when the person at the center refuses to stay anchored, refuses to follow the script, refuses to recognize that the script exists for a reason. And that reason is not optics, but stability, because the stakes here weren't theoretical, they were immediate, involving sanctions, energy markets, regional power balances, and billions of dollars in future access. And the oil executives in that room weren't there out of civic duty. They were there because proximity to power is profitable, because uncertainty creates opportunity, and because when a leader is erratic, those who know how to flatter, redirect, and wait him out often benefit the most. And that dynamic played out in real time as praise became a currency, compliments became leverage, and policy discussion slowly gave way to performance, with executives carefully choosing words that would keep the president engaged without challenging him, while officials like Marco Rubio were forced into the uncomfortable role of minder rather than strategist, slipping notes, redirecting conversation, trying to keep the machinery running while the engine sputtered. And what's striking is how visible this has become, because in past administrations these corrections happened quietly, off camera, behind closed doors. But here they unfolded live, unfiltered, revealing a White House operating in reactive mode, constantly adjusting to the president's impulses rather than executing a coherent plan. And this is where Fox News' decision to cut away becomes crucial, because it wasn't an editorial statement, it was an acknowledgement that the moment had crossed from defendable to indefensible, that viewers were seeing something that could not be framed as strength or authenticity, something that raised questions no talking point could erase. And when even friendly media chooses to look away, it signals a deeper recognition that the spectacle is no longer manageable, that the unpredictability has become a liability rather than an asset. And this isn't about partisan preference, it's about institutional strain, because the presidency is designed to concentrate power under the assumption of competence. And when competence is inconsistent, the surrounding institutions stretch to compensate, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, but always at a cost. And that cost accumulates in subtle ways, in delayed decisions, in mixed signals to allies, in confusion among agencies tasked with implementation, and in the normalization of behavior that would have been unthinkable in previous eras, like a president abandoning a policy meeting midstream to admire a room. And the danger of normalization is that it lowers expectations, that people begin to accept distraction as personality, improvisation as leadership, and confusion as authenticity. And once that happens, accountability becomes harder to enforce because every lapse is reframed as style rather than substance. And yet, beneath the surface, professionals inside the system are forced to pick up the slack, to quietly translate impulsive remarks into actionable policy, to reassure partners that what was said offhand won't suddenly become doctrine, and to monitor markets for reactions to statements that were never meant to be statements at all. And this constant translation drains institutional energy, pulling focus away from long-term planning and toward short-term stabilization. And nowhere is this more evident than in meetings like this one, where the overlap between government authority and corporate interest is already sensitive, already fraught, already vulnerable to accusations of favoritism. Because when executives praise the president and the president responds with access, warmth, and visible appreciation, it reinforces the perception that influence is transactional, that proximity buys favor, and that policy outcomes are shaped less by public interest than by personal rapport. And this perception doesn't require corruption to be damaging. It only requires ambiguity, because trust in institutions depends on the belief that decisions are made through process, not impulse, through analysis, not applause. And when viewers see a president more energized by compliments than by briefings, more attentive to scenery than to substance, that trust erodes, not dramatically, not overnight, but steadily, and the consequences extend beyond one administration, because every future leader inherits a system shaped by precedent, and when precedent shifts towards spectacle over seriousness, the bar for conduct lowers, the margin for error narrows, and the risk of miscalculation grows, especially in areas like foreign policy and energy, where signals are scrutinized and misreadings can escalate quickly. And this is why moments like this resonate far beyond the news cycle, because they crystallize broader concerns about attention, discipline, and the ability to manage complexity, concerns that cannot be dismissed as political attacks when they are visible, documented, and reacted to in real time by allies and critics alike. And as the meeting eventually stumbled back on track, with aides guiding the conversation forward and executives returning to prepared remarks, the impression lingered that the real work was happening around the president rather than through him, that governance had become an exercise in containment rather than leadership, and that the most revealing aspect of the day wasn't any single statement or policy hint, but the quiet acknowledgement by everyone involved that unpredictability had become the defining feature of the room, a feature to be managed, mitigated, and endured rather than addressed head-on. And that acknowledgement, more than any headline or clip, is what makes this moment so significant, because it shows a system adapting to instability instead of correcting it, and adaptation without correction always carries a price. As the cameras moved on and the headlines began to crystallize, the most consequential story unfolded off-screen, in the silent calculations of those tasked with protecting power rather than questioning it, because moments like this force every actor in the orbit of the presidency to make a choice, not publicly but internally, about how far they are willing to go to preserve continuity. And that's where figures like J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio become less like individual politicians and more like case studies in institutional survival, navigating a delicate balance between loyalty and responsibility, visibility and discretion, knowing that every intervention risks backlash and every silence risks complicity. And in that tension, you can see how modern governance bends around personality, how aides and allies learn to anticipate detours, how they prepare for unpredictability not by correcting it but by cushioning its impact, crafting statements, redirecting conversations, smoothing reactions, and framing disruptions as eccentricities rather than warning signs, because in a polarized environment, the fear of empowering opponents often outweighs the impulse to confront internal problems, and this is where the media ecosystem plays its role, amplifying or muting moments based on alignment, shaping narratives that reassure some audiences while alarming others. And yet even within that ecosystem there are limits, thresholds beyond which containment fails, and the cutaway by a friendly outlet signaled that one of those thresholds had been crossed, that the moment could no longer be framed as authenticity or strength without stretching credibility beyond repair. And this fracture matters because media coverage doesn't just reflect reality, it stabilizes it, providing cues to viewers about what is normal, acceptable, and expected. And when those cues falter, uncertainty spreads, not just among voters, but among markets, allies, and institutions that rely on predictability. And predictability is the unsung currency of power. The quiet assurance that decisions will follow process even when outcomes are contested, and when that assurance weakens, the vacuum is filled by speculation, rumor, and hedging behavior, with partners delaying commitments, adversaries testing boundaries, and domestic agencies seeking clarification that may never come. And all of this traces back to the fundamental question raised by that meeting. Who is actually steering the ship? Because leadership isn't measured by volume or confidence. It's measured by the ability to absorb information, to prioritize, to stay present when the stakes are abstract and the rewards are delayed. And the spectacle of a president disengaging mid-discussion crystallized a concern long whispered in private that governance had become performative, reactive, and dependent on intermediaries to translate impulse into policy. And this dependency creates its own hierarchy, elevating those who can interpret mood over those who can analyze data, rewarding flattery over candor, and encouraging a culture where uncomfortable truths are softened or deferred, not because they are false, but because they disrupt momentum. And over time, this culture reshapes decision-making, narrowing the range of options considered, favoring actions that generate immediate approval, and sidelining those that require sustained attention and patience. And nowhere is this more dangerous than in foreign policy, where miscommunication can escalate rapidly, and energy policy, where markets respond instantly to perceived signals because a casual remark can move prices, a vague promise can trigger investment, and an offhand dismissal can undermine leverage painstakingly built over years. And when observers see a president more engaged by atmosphere than analysis, they adjust accordingly, discounting statements, seeking back channels, and placing greater weight on signals from aides rather than the leader himself, which effectively redistributes power away from the elected figure toward an unelected network of managers, a shift that may stabilize short-term operations but raises profound questions about accountability, because when outcomes are shaped by those operating behind the scenes, responsibility becomes diffuse, praise and blame harder to assign, and democratic oversight weaker. And this diffusion is not theoretical. It manifests in real decisions, in who gets access, whose calls are returned, which memos are read, and which warnings are sidelined. And the meeting with oil executives exposed this dynamic with unusual clarity, showing how praise opens doors, how proximity amplifies influence, and how distraction creates space for those prepared to fill it. And while defenders may argue that this is simply how politics works, the difference lies in degree, in the visibility of the process, and in the erosion of norms designed to keep personal impulse from overshadowing public interest. Because norms exist not to constrain personality, but to protect stability, to ensure that the immense power of the presidency is exercised deliberately rather than impulsively, and when those norms weaken, the system becomes more brittle, less resilient to shocks, and more vulnerable to miscalculation. And this vulnerability doesn't announce itself with crisis sirens. It accumulates quietly, in meetings that drift, in notes passed across tables, in cameras cutting away, and in the collective decision to move on rather than confront. And as commentators debated optics and partisans argued intent, the deeper issue remained unresolved: whether the institutions designed to support leadership were now compensating for its absence, and whether that compensation could continue indefinitely without cost, because history suggests it cannot, that systems stretched to absorb unpredictability eventually reach a breaking point, not because of a single moment, but because of the normalization of many, and the meeting that began as a routine display of authority ended as a symbol of that normalization, a snapshot of power adapting to distraction. And the question it leaves behind is not about politics, but about governance itself, about whether a system can remain effective when presence becomes optional, focus intermittent, and spectacle a substitute for stewardship. And this is where the story ultimately lands, not in outrage or mockery, but in a quieter, more unsettling realization about what power looks like when attention fractures and responsibility diffuses. Because the presidency is not a personality contest or a stage for constant affirmation, it is a job that demands sustained presence, even when the room is dull, even when the briefing is repetitive, even when the applause fades. And when a leader treats those moments as optional, the cost isn't paid in headlines, it's paid in trust, in clarity, and in the slow erosion of democratic expectations. Because citizens don't just elect a person, they entrust an office, and that office carries obligations that extend beyond personal comfort or impulse. And what that meeting revealed more than any policy stance or talking point was a gap between the gravity of the role and the behavior on display, a gap that institutions can manage for a while but cannot erase, because no amount of staffing, scripting, or media framing can fully substitute for engagement at the top. And the danger isn't that a single meeting went off script, it's that everyone involved seemed prepared for it to happen, ready with notes, redirects, and contingency plans, as if unpredictability had become an assumed variable rather than an anomaly. And when unpredictability is assumed, standards quietly shift, accountability softens, and the line between governance and improvisation blurs, leaving citizens to wonder who is truly making decisions and on what basis. And this is where the public's role becomes essential, because democracy doesn't function on autopilot. It relies on attention, scrutiny, and a willingness to ask uncomfortable questions, even when answers are inconvenient. Questions about fitness, focus, and the mechanisms we use to evaluate leadership beyond slogans and spectacle. And none of this requires partisan allegiance. It requires seriousness, the recognition that power without discipline is not strength, that charisma without concentration is not leadership, and that institutions designed to serve the public cannot indefinitely compensate for disengagement at the center. And as viewers reflect on that moment, the wandering glance, the abandoned meeting, the quiet cutaway, the aides stepping in, the executives waiting patiently, the cameras turning elsewhere, the takeaway isn't a punchline, it's a warning about normalization, about how easily extraordinary behavior becomes routine when repeated often enough, and how difficult it becomes to reverse that slide once expectations adjust downward. And the future doesn't hinge on one person or one clip. It hinges on whether citizens insist that the office demands more than presence, more than performance, more than praise, whether they insist on focus, coherence, and accountability as non-negotiable standards, because the health of a system is measured not by how it performs under ideal conditions, but by how it responds when stress reveals its weaknesses. And what we saw was stress revealing adaptation rather than correction, containment rather than confrontation. And while that may keep the lights on in the short term, it raises profound questions about long-term resilience, questions that won't be answered by cutting away or moving on, but by sustained engagement, informed discussion, and a collective refusal to lower the bar for leadership simply because doing so feels easier. And if there is one enduring image from that day, it is not the ballroom or the headlines. It is the moment when the weight of the office seemed lighter than it should be, and the responsibility to notice, to question, and to respond shifted quietly but unmistakably back to the public watching.